when a stranger tries to kidnap 2 children.
It was just terrifying. And all I could see was my car leaving.
It was a life or death situation.
It seems hopeless.
He had grabbed onto Skylar's hoodie, preventing her from leaving.
But then a brave 8-year-old fights back.
Something the young boy does will change everything.
It's incredible.
And coming up later,
strange woman walked up and just tried to take that child.
Another terrifying kidnapping attempt.
She used force to pick him up.
I don't know what was going to happen there.
Thwarted by a 12-year-old girl.
I told her we were going to have problems.
I still can't get over it.
It happens just after 4 p.m. on April 25th, 2019, in Middletown, Ohio. A grandmother pulls up to an emergency room with her daughter and grandkids in the car. There's a man squatting near the door who seems out of it. The woman helps her daughter, who hasn't been feeling well for days, into a wheelchair and takes her inside. Just a few seconds later, the strange man approaches the car, jumps into the driver's seat, and floors it, with the grandkids inside.
Sent an officer immediately. Police had a vehicle stolen.
The 2 young children are just 8 and 10 years old.
I heard them scream, the terror scream of pure fear.
Security cameras capture their grandmother frantically trying to chase the car down.
The grandmother on a dead sprint trying to get control of this vehicle.
Running after the car in sheer panic.
Just like that, a trip to the hospital turns into a nightmare.
So what starts off as a carjacking now is turning into a kidnapping.
It was a life or death situation. If he takes those kids and we don't locate that vehicle, who knows where these kids could have been kidnapped and taken to.
What does this man want, and why has he targeted them?
There's a very good chance they had some pretty nefarious thoughts in mind.
It's a day Nita Coburn will never forget.
It was just the thought that he had them.
When she pulls up to the Atrium Medical Center, she's extremely concerned about her daughter.
When Angie was so sick, she was real sick. I told the kids, you just stay right there, it'll be okay.
As she helps her daughter into the wheelchair, she thinks her grandkids, 10-year-old Skylar and 8-year-old Chance, are safe inside the car.
The kids were in the back seat, and I thought I locked the door, but it wasn't.
Nita is barely inside the hospital door when she hears screams and races back to see what's going on.
At first, I didn't know what was happening. And then when I seen him climbing in my car, it was just terrifying. It was like, I was screaming at the top of my lungs. He had my babies.
Nita immediately dashes after the car. As she approaches, she gets a chilling glimpse of her grandchildren's kidnapper.
He just looked at me and just had this look on his face, a non-caring look. What went through my brain instantly was they were going to be gone and I wasn't going to get them back.
Determined not to let that happen, somehow Nita manages to hang on to the car door.
I grabbed a hold of the door handle. Car door opened up about a few inches. I was hanging onto the door with both my hands.
For a moment, she has a firm grip on the moving car, refusing to let go.
I was hanging on for their lives. I didn't care about me.
But the kidnapper isn't about to let Nita ruin his plan.
And he just jerked that car door closed again.
As the door handle slips out of her hands, Nita tumbles to the ground. But what she doesn't know is that inside the car, the children are fighting to get out, even as the kidnapper desperately tries to keep them trapped inside.
He had grabbed onto Skylar's hoodie, preventing her from leaving.
As the kidnapper struggles to hang on to 10-year-old Skylar, her little brother, Chance, frantically tries to protect her.
He goes to grab his sister to pull her out, but now the kidnapper is pulling her to avoid that from happening. So now we have a really dangerous situation here, but something the young boy does will change everything.
He's probably the bravest kid I've ever met.
Caught on surveillance video.
Their grandmother tried to chase the driver down.
As a strange man drives off with Nita Coburn's car and her grandchildren, 8-year-old Chance and 10-year-old Skylar, still in the back seat, she frantically tries to hold on to the door. but can't keep her grip and falls to the pavement.
When I went down, I twisted around. I got hurt really bad.
Now, the children share what it was like watching their grandmother from inside that car on a ride from hell.
She was so close to the car, and I figured that she was more than likely going to get ran over. It was really scary, very terrifying.
It all begins when they notice this man lurking outside the entrance to the emergency room.
We parked probably about 2-3 feet in front of him. He had a black bag, and he was smoking a cigarette. And he started walking towards the car, and he said something in a different language, and then he got in the car and shut the door. I was kind of in shock.
Suddenly, the siblings are stuck in a car with a dangerous stranger, and they have no idea what he wants. Chance is sitting behind the kidnapper. His first instinct is to protect his sister.
The young boy has the wherewithal that, okay, we're in danger, and we need to get the heck out of here.
Chance tries to unbuckle their seatbelts, but the man isn't about to let them go.
I unbuckled my seatbelt, then I opened the door, and when I went to get out, he put his foot on the gas.
To the children's horror, the man also has a tight grip on Skylar.
He had a hold of my arm and my hood on my jacket. He wrapped his hand around it and was holding onto it really hard.
As he struggles to pull his sister away from the kidnapper, Chance falls out of the car. But he's not about to let the kidnapper get away with her.
I feel like if I didn't try to help her, I wouldn't see her ever again. And I ran back up to the car, and I was holding on to her arm.
He did something that a hero would do, dragging his sister out of the vehicle, pulling them both out to safety.
Not only does this young man have the presence of mind to try to unbuckle, he's also able to successfully fight off his attacker.
Luckily, before he was able to drive off with them, an amazing feat of bravery.
Skylar immediately runs towards their grandmother, who is still in a total panic because she doesn't realize both kids are now finally safe.
All I could think was then that Chance was still in there.
She was crying just because of how scared she was. She was banged up, but she was more concerned about the safety of the two children.
The man is now speeding away. Police chase after him.
That vehicle was a silver 2013 Malibu.
Who is he? And what would have happened if this brave little boy had not pulled his sister out of the car?
Imagine what could have happened. There's a very good chance that girl wouldn't be here today.
Just 10 minutes after the kidnapper flees, police stop him and arrest him.
It appeared that he was in distress. He was extremely indifferent about the incident.
It turns out that Officer Connor Kirby had actually dropped the man, 24-year-old Dalveer Singh, at the emergency room earlier that morning.
The reason being is Dalveer advised that he had been using heroin and that he had wanted some sort of drug treatment. He had already been what he had called heroin sick. He was from India and he had been in Middletown for just a couple days.
But Dalveer doesn't offer any explanation for why he tried to kidnap two children.
He knew that the kids were inside of the vehicle.
It's unclear as to whether or not his motives were looking to kidnap children or someone just looking to grab a car to use that vehicle to further his addiction.
I don't think he understood what kind of impact he's going to have on these kids forever.
But nobody will ever forget what these two brave children did that day.
That 8-year-old now being hailed a hero for saving himself and his sister. The foresight an 8-year-old had to pull his 10-year-old sister out of the car.
It just shows how much Chance loves his sister. He got into a heroic mode and he knew that he needed to do something. He's a very humble kid, but he knows what he did was special. And I always tell him how proud I am of him.
The kid's aunt, who they were taking to the hospital, was treated for an apparent virus and made a full recovery. And they affectionately say that Kirby is now like a big brother to them. He says he's just lucky to know them.
So it's just incredible to see two heroic children.
As for Dalveer Singh, he was charged with 2 counts of kidnapping, felonious assault for dragging Nita, and grand theft, and was sentenced to 11 years. Meanwhile, the 2 kids have been honored for their courage by the city of Middletown.
We went to a Reds game. It was really fun. We were in a parade, with the July parade.
But Skylar and Chance don't like to watch the video of the attempted abduction.
It makes me think about it, and it sometimes gives me nightmares.
And their grandmother says they tend to stick close to loved ones now. But she couldn't be prouder of how brave they both were that day.
Skylar, God love her, she kept saying, "It's all right, Grandma, Chance." He's a good baby. I knew he was brave, but oh wow, I was real proud of him.
Seeing Singh in court has been difficult for all of them. But surprisingly, Skylar, who is now 11, says she isn't angry with him.
Everyone makes mistakes. He just made a worse mistake than most people. I forgive him.
Still, knowing how dangerously close they came to losing each other weighs heavily on these tight-knit siblings, who now have a closer bond than ever.
Wow, I'm really proud of my brother for what he did. I saved my sister.
And coming up next, the heroic actions of another brave sibling.
I was very mad. I felt, I gotta get there, I gotta go, I gotta grab him.
Every parent lives in fear of a moment like this.
This is a really unnerving reminder.
And it can happen anywhere at any time.
This is disturbing stuff.
Lawton, Oklahoma, December 26, 2019. It's the day after Christmas, and it's lunchtime at Freddy's Frozen Custard and Steak Burgers. A woman enters the restaurant with 3 children. She's their grandmother. She sits the 2 youngest children down at the table, a 2-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. Then, the eldest child, a 12-year-old girl, and the grandmother leave the small children for a moment to go to the counter to get their soft drinks. And when she returns, something shocking happens. Another woman walks over to the table where the 2 youngest children are seated.
The woman behaves in a manner that would maybe let people who were onlookers believe that she knew these children.
And it gets even stranger.
She goes so far as to kiss the children.
But the children don't know this strange woman at all.
Why on earth would a woman approach the children of someone else in a restaurant like this? What's going on here?
After hugging the girl and kissing the young boy, she leaves their table and goes to the counter.
The kind of behavior she exhibits, there's clearly something wrong with her.
The children's grandmother seems confused. Could this be someone who knows her grandchildren? But she's about to find out that the strange woman has more sinister intentions. When her back is turned, the woman returns to the table and does the unthinkable. She snatches the 2-year-old boy. A call goes out to 911.
The employees saw everything, and
an officer is going to be dispatched.
90 from here and out to Freddy's.
Just a few miles away, the children's mother, Crystal Phillips, is hard at work. She hasn't been able to get to her phone in hours.
It was the day after Christmas. I work at the hospital. I get a few calls, but I can't check it because, we're really busy.
She doesn't yet know she's already received the call every mother dreads.
So on my downtime, I saw my phone and I got 3 missed calls, one from my daughter, one from my mom, one from my husband. And so finally, when I'm able to call back, my mom answers frantically, "Someone tried to take your child."
I'm not gonna lie, the Southern rage just took over. I was hot. It was just a total shock factor. It was like, how does this happen?
Crystal and Stedman immediately leave their respective places of work and race to the restaurant.
I didn't need to hear anything else. I just imagined the worst. You see news stories of child abduction. It's kind of like every mom's worst fear.
The worst part for me was not being able to be there for them, because my biggest thing is, as a dad, that's your #1 job, is protect the kids. That's all I'm here for.
Who is this woman, and what does she want with their son?
Abduction is probably one of the scariest things that any of us, and especially any of us who are parents, could ever imagine. Often, abductions result in permanent tragedy.
Watch the top left of your screen there. Police say the strange woman walked up and just tried to take that child.
A female walked in, reached over and grabbed a 2-year-old boy from his car seat at the table.
December 26, 2019 starts like any other day for 12-year-old Makayla Phillips. It's the day after Christmas, and Makayla's parents, Crystal and Stedman, are already back at work. Makayla and her 2 siblings, her 2-year-old brother Brett, and her 4-year-old sister Ariana spend the day with their grandmother.
We were just chilling with my grandma, just riding around, having fun, because she wanted to get us out of the house.
She takes the 3 children to Freddy's Frozen Custard and Steak Burgers on Cash Road.
We went in, and then me and her went to go get drinks for my little brother and sister and us. And I went to go get straws.
That's when Makayla notices the strange woman watching her and her 2-year-old brother.
She didn't seem right. She just didn't look like she was all there. She didn't look normal. Give them both a hug and kiss both of them. I was like, that's weird. Like, people don't kiss other people's kids. Then when she picked up my brother, she was saying that it was her baby. My brother, he didn't really know what was happening.
But before the woman can leave the restaurant with the small child, Makayla springs into action.
When she picked up my brother, she was saying that it was her baby, and I just kept yelling back that it was my brother and it wasn't her baby, and that she needs to stop touching my brother.
Then, Makayla does something brave. She tries to save her little brother.
I was very mad. I felt like, I gotta get there, I gotta go, I gotta grab him.
Makayla literally pulls Brett out of the woman's arms.
She started yelling at me that it was her son and to give him back, but I started yelling back that she needs to stop touching my brother, and I told her that if she touched him again, we were gonna have problems.
Her quick thinking and decisive actions buy enough time for her grandmother and a waitress to come to his rescue. At last, he is safe. When Makayla's relieved parents arrive at the restaurant, managers replay the chilling footage to show them exactly what happened to their children.
He showed me the video and I recorded it on my phone. That was just like crushing to me. So the fact that she picked him up like that was a lot of force to use. That wasn't just a hug. She used force to pick him up. That's when I understood that this woman is not mentally stable. And I don't know if that made me feel better or terrified me more.
But the video also shows her just how brave her daughter Makayla really was.
She's always been like that, though. She's a protective person by nature. She'll stick up for anyone. She'll, protect anyone. That's just how she is.
This is my tomboy. Just like her father, she won't cry or anything.
The strange woman leaves the restaurant still unidentified. So many questions linger. Who is this woman? What does she want with a 2-year-old boy? And where did she plan to take him?
The thing that was really bad was the restaurant's right next to a freeway. So if she would have just made out the door, we don't know what was going to happen there.
Who knows what could have happened? My worst fear is that it means she was homeless, that if she took him, I wouldn't be able to find him. If she's living on the street, there's no known addresses to hunt down. Where would I even start looking?
1 week later, police finally identify the mysterious woman who tried to snatch 2-year-old Brett Phillips, Michelle Renee Litton. A warrant is issued for her arrest for a felony count of forcibly taking away a child. She is taken into custody on January 2nd, 2020.
But when they caught her, I felt better. But I try not to think about it because it's my baby brother.
It turns out Michelle Renee Litton has had multiple prior interactions with law enforcement and suffers from mental illness.
I feel like she does need help, 100%. I don't think she was purposely targeting him. I think she was just looking for a little boy, to replace her son that she said she had.
She's not cognizant of what's going on. So her sitting in jail, I feel like that's not going to do anything. Let's honestly get her help and let's get her off the street, rehabilitate her. There's going to be a lot more positivity towards her and towards everyone.
Despite their young son's agonizing brush with danger, Stedman and Crystal are relieved to know there's someone in their family who won't hesitate to do the right thing.
Oh, I'm so proud. I'm so proud of her. I have these 2 little kids and, I worry about them, but, knowing that she has the ability to protect them when I'm not there, I'm very grateful for that.
Did a great job, Princess.
I'm always impressed when people act. In the absence of assistance, they act. And because of their actions, tragedy is averted. Courage and bravery. And again, in this case, this 12-year-old girl's actions, very likely she saved her brother's life.
Coeur d'Alene, where's your emergency? My house is being robbed by 2 individuals.
A home is invaded in broad daylight, and hidden cameras capture everything.
I was extremely angry. To be so nonchalant about it, like they're shopping.
Including a tense confrontation. And a breathtaking twist.
I've been doing this for 19 years. I've seen some pretty strange things. This definitely ranks them on the top of them.
And coming up later, another home is broken into.
A strange man had just walked into their home.
A woman stands face to face with danger.
My insides were just racing. My one and only thought is my son cannot defend himself.
Before an unlikely hero changes everything.
You don't even have to know the story to watch that video and think, this is incredible.
Home invasions happen every day.
The 2 men walking room to room, scoping out the loot.
911 Coeur d'Alene, where's your emergency? My house is being robbed by 2 individuals. Please get somebody there right away.
April 8th, 2016, 7:30 a.m. A quiet spring morning in Fairhaven, Massachusetts is shattered by the sound of smashing glass. Within seconds, an unidentified man enters a home that is not his own.
The burglar broke in through the back door, went to the front of the house, opened the front door, and invited the second burglar into the home. Once they were inside, they started to peruse the residence, all the while being observed by the resident owner's dog.
What they don't know is that a security camera is already catching their every move. They wander about the first floor, taking their time as if they're looking for something. Their behavior is odd.
A lot of burglars, when they commit a burglary and they enter into a residence or a business, are in a frantic state of mind and being and move in a way that is commensurate with that. And then there are other ones who are brazen and don't care, and those are the ones that are potentially dangerous. The burglars were very relaxed. They moved slowly around the home, apparently completely unaware that they were on surveillance video.
They even call out to the homeowner's dog.
You want a treat? Come on, come get a treat. Come on.
What are they looking for? And why did they choose this particular house? Whatever it is, they haven't found it yet. So they decide to head upstairs.
In this case, one of the burglars actually goes into the daughter's bedroom.
But there's something else these 2 men don't know. Not only are they being recorded by a security camera, they're being watched by the homeowner himself, graphic designer Damien Gerard.
It was a Friday morning, and I had left my house with my daughter. I was bringing her to school, and then I got to work. So it was about 7:30 when I got the alert on my computer that there was activity on my cameras.
Damien works just a few miles away. After getting a security alert, he pulls up the video feed and gets a terrifying shock.
I was really mad. Just the fact that somebody's going to take someone else's personal property, but to be so nonchalant about it, like they're shopping.
You want a treat? Come on.
I'm thinking, what's he going to do? What's he going to do with my dog? Is he going to try to silence her somehow? There was a lot of thoughts were running through my head.
He immediately calls the police.
911 record line, where's your emergency? My house is being robbed by 2 individuals. Please get somebody there right away.
We received a call from Mr. Gerard on a 911 system, and he told us that he was actually watching a break in progress at his residence from his video surveillance system inside his house.
You know who they are? No, I do not. I just saw it on my security cam.
Damien gave us a play-by-play as to where the suspects were in his house as our officers were responding.
Where were they in the house? One was walking in the front door. The other one came in from the other way.
Damien jumps in his car, and just 8.5 minutes after receiving the alert that his security camera had been activated, arrives home. The Fairhaven Police and Massachusetts State Police are already waiting for him in his driveway.
I gave one of the officers the key to my house, and they unlocked the door and all ran in.
When you arrive on scene, you never really know what is going to happen or how it's going to unfold. It's a very dynamic, fluid situation. You don't know what's around the next corner. You're not exactly sure how many suspects you may be encountering, whether they're armed, what their intentions are. Entering a house in a situation like this can be very, very dangerous. You're pretty much going in blind.
Third floor there! On your feet!
The homeowner got the alert, called the police, and then watched the whole drama play out live.
Damien Gerard had had his home broken into when he was a child, so he knew installing security cameras was a smart move. But not even he expected to watch his own home being invaded right before his eyes. After receiving an alert, Damien logs on to check his home's security cameras and gets a gut-wrenching shock. A clear view of 2 men burglarizing his house.
You don't expect to see a stranger in your house. Then they're, calling your dog over. My heart just sank at that moment when I realized what was going on. I had said out loud, my house is being robbed. My coworkers, which a cubicle is right alongside me, both jumped up and were looking at my screen as I got up and was running out of the building, calling 911.
And where were they in the house? One was walking in the front door. The other one came in from the other way.
As Damien rushes to meet police at his home, his colleagues are glued to the live security camera video.
And my coworkers all watched it happen live. It was like they were watching a TV show. So they were huddled around my computer the whole time.
They watch as, guns drawn, Fairhaven police officers carefully enter the house and go upstairs, unsure of exactly where the suspects are or what could happen next.
Entering a house in a situation like this can be very, very dangerous. You're pretty much going in blind.
Third floor down. Third floor down! Hands behind your back. Who else is with you?
Officer Betancourt recounted one of the suspects who was in the process of gathering up valuables from inside the residence. He ordered him to the ground, placed him in handcuffs, and took him into custody without incident.
Broke into a house. I didn't break into anything.
However, the second man has other ideas.
While he was taking him into custody, the second perpetrator jumped out the second-floor window. In fact, if you watch the video, you can see the silhouette of him falling down through the window to the ground. I've been doing this for 19 years. I've seen some pretty strange things. This definitely ranks him on the top of them.
So he came out of this window, jumped down to here. They ran across the yard this way, hopped this fence, ran into this park. I was extremely angry. Your imagination just goes wild. You want revenge, you want justice.
Damien is furious. He sees red. He's so angry he chases after the fleeing robber, while the Fairhaven police close in quickly.
While it's understandable that some crime victims are so angry and overcome by emotion that they confront or pursue the perpetrator, that can be very dangerous, especially when you don't know what the perpetrator is capable of or if he's armed.
I don't know what I was going to do if I caught him. I kept calling him told him to stop. I'm going to kill you.
Fortunately, though, before the homeowner can catch up to the burglar, the police catch up and they arrest the second fleeing burglar.
And Damien returns to his home to assess the damage. What he finds delivers a gut punch.
They were in my daughter's room. They went through all her stuff, her, jewelry, everything. They had taken a pillowcase and they were putting everything in it. So they had my daughter's piggy bank in there. They had a change jar from my son's room. I don't know. I don't understand how they can go into a room that's obviously a little girl's room, and start ransacking it, taking her piggy bank, taking an 11-year-old girl's piggy bank. It kind of makes you wonder. She's a pretty tough kid. She definitely felt funny here for the first few weeks afterwards, especially where they were in her room. It makes me sad that there's people in the world like that, and it can happen anywhere.
28-year-old Brian Chandanias was the burglar arrested in the home. 29-year-old Jay Birch was arrested after police caught up with him.
They were both charged with breaking and entering the daytime to commit a felony, possession of burglarious instruments, and 2 counts of vandalism.
If I could have asked them one thing, why my house? It's not flashy, it's just a regular place. As a matter of fact, at that time, the house next door to me belonged to a Fairhaven police sergeant. I think if they were watching, they probably wouldn't have picked it, just knowing I have a couple of neighbors that work in law enforcement.
And it turns out the break-in may have been a case of mistaken identity.
It seemed like it was just like a smash and grab, but the Fairhaven police seemed to think that they had the wrong house targeted. I think they believed they were breaking in somewhere else.
They obviously broke into the wrong house because they chose the house that had the video surveillance system, which ultimately got them convicted.
And most important of all, Damien's beloved pets are safe and sound.
We really love our pets here. That was like my biggest concern.
Chloe, you okay?
Yeah. This is Chloe the Wonder Dog, guard dog extraordinaire.
Coming up.
She screamed bloody murder. I mean, you don't even have to know the story to watch that video and think, this is incredible.
It may be the state capital, but for those who live there, Oklahoma City feels like a small town.
I've always said Oklahoma's just different than everywhere else. It's kind of like a big family.
But that warm community feeling is shattered by a terrifying home invasion in broad daylight.
Strange man had just walked into their home.
He just came into my home.
Monday, January 13th, 2020. Northwest 6th Street in downtown Oklahoma City, 4:15 in the afternoon. A woman is at home with her son and her 2 dogs, a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. Her husband is out of town, and her other children are grown and out of the house. The new modern home has been equipped with security cameras, and they soon capture some disturbing activity. A large man holding a black sack breaks into the house.
He was white male. He was probably about 6 foot. His hair was very long, very scraggly, very dirty. He was not the kind of guy you would want to see standing in your foyer when you walk around the corner. He had walked up the sidewalk on the east side of the house. There are 3 doors that go into the house from there. He chose the middle door, which was unlocked, and walked into the house. Usually people try to break in to houses where people are at work and nobody is at home. I don't believe this guy actually knew anybody was in the house, but I don't know that he would have cared if he did know.
In the adjacent dining room, the unsuspecting homeowner has no idea there's an intruder in her house.
So she was home alone with her son who was blind. He can't see what's happening. All he can do is listen. He heard him come into the house and heard a little bit of rummaging. So she thought, maybe my other son is home. He shouldn't be, but maybe he just came in the back door for whatever reason.
The first to check out the intruder is Dubai, a 122-pound Great Dane.
Her Great Dane had come trotting in there with his tail wagging until he saw somebody that he didn't know. You could see the demeanor of the dog change instantly. The tail went down. He didn't become aggressive, but he circled the guy, and the guy was able to pet the dog, and the dog wasn't real sure of what was going on.
You could tell he was maybe sniffing around, thinking to himself, who is this? What's going on here? The stranger that had broken into the home actually reached down to pet him, and Dubai was pretty friendly.
It seems the large dog is too gentle to offer much protection to the woman and her son sitting in the next room. But then, the woman goes out to the kitchen to see what's going on. and gets a horrifying shock.
I think she was expecting it to be her older son, if not at least one of her kids, but was nobody that she knew and nobody that she'd seen before or recognized. She was just panicked, almost frozen, just wondering who this person is, what do they want, how am I going to get myself out of this situation safely? And not only myself, but my handicapped son who's also home with me.
The woman stands less than 5 feet tall, and she is unarmed. There is only one thing she can do.
She screamed bloody murder.
And the fear in his beloved owner's voice triggers something deep within Dubai, as well as in Autumn, the family Chihuahua.
Animals, they can pick up on their handlers or riders' energy. They can pick up on that real easy. Dubai felt her energy and knew that this was not right. Once she screamed, he thought, well, okay, now she's going to approve of it. I'm going to eat this guy.
A bold and frightening home invasion is caught on camera.
Surveillance video shows the suspect walking into the home.
Tracy McCoy and her family had just moved to a new home in Oklahoma City a few months earlier, and the close-knit family is used to people coming and going.
It was just an ordinary day, like any other day. At the time, it was just me and one of my sons, Nathaniel, who is blind and delayed. And he and I were sitting with our back towards the door, and we were eating and just waiting for brother to get here so that we could go to the grocery store. So when I heard a side door open, I thought absolutely nothing about it. I thought there was just someone I knew coming through that door. We heard him come in. We heard him kind of mess around and walk around. We were facing the other direction, didn't even think to turn around.
Tracy sees her Great Dane Dubai go investigate, and then hears footsteps approaching.
I knew he was coming into the kitchen area, and I stood up and I turned around, and I had a smile on my face, and I was going to welcome him, and I came face to face to a complete stranger. My insides were just racing, and I just wanted him gone.
Tracy is terrified of the huge man standing in her home, not just for herself, but for her son, Nathaniel, in the next room.
My one and only thought is I had my son sitting at the table that could not defend himself, and all I could think of is that man just had to be out of my home. I had to have him on the other side. He could not be in here.
And her 122-pound Great Dane isn't doing anything to protect her or her son.
Dubai is very mild-mannered. He's very sweet, very passive. I would have anticipated him more hiding behind his mother for protection instead of protecting her.
So Tracy decides to use the only weapon she has on hand, her voice.
I screamed. I honestly did not know if I had just made a really big mistake in screaming like that. I had no idea if he was armed, if he was dangerous, if he was just there to rob us. I had absolutely no clue.
At first, the strange man doesn't react, but Dubai does.
As soon as she screamed is when Dubai, the dog, knew that it wasn't somebody that was supposed to be in their house. Dubai immediately starts biting him and pushing him out the door.
He turned very quick. He learned to be aggressive instantly by her reaction. I think that's where Dubai got his protectiveness. He felt Tracy's energy and knew that this was not right. Dubai went for the guy's butt, and then when the guy turned and started to go out, the next thing was the guy's face or neck. I know he jumped up high and got pushed off, and together they were able to get him out of the house.
You don't even have to know the story or hear us talk about it to watch that video and think, this is incredible.
Once the man is out of the house, Tracy slams the door behind him.
Once Dubai and I got him on the other side of the door, I made sure Dubai stayed in. I did not want him following him out. So he finally made his way through the gate, and once I saw that he was actually leaving, at that point in time, I did call 911.
Oklahoma City 911.
Just had a guy come into, I think he's just homeless. He just came into my home, and he's walking out of my gate right now. He's walking down the street going west.
As Oklahoma PD race to the residence, the intruder takes off. but he doesn't get far.
They got there super quick and they were able to catch the guy before he even made it down the street.
Tracy gave a good enough description over the radio, and our officers were close enough that they were able to catch him within 2 blocks, and she positively identified him.
Tracy had attended a citizens academy with our police department. She knew to study his face, to remember features about him that she could tell police.
The intruder turns out to be 30-year-old Robert Ward.
He said he came in down here from Kansas on a bus. His story was that it looked like a house of somebody that he knew, and that's why he went in there.
Robert Ward is arrested and charged with burglary, and everyone agrees that the hero of the day is Dubai, and it's all been captured on camera.
When we saw the video, I was quite embarrassed for Dubai because he let him just sit there and pet him, a total stranger coming to our home. So it's like I was a little embarrassed for him, but then when he did what he did, he made up for it.
I think this crime was scary. It's especially scary when you have a kid home, especially a kid that needs your help 24/7. But I also think it could have ended a lot worse, and we're lucky that it didn't. A lot of people don't have a 6-foot Great Dane that can protect them from anybody who waltzes into their home. It was such a good reminder for people that pets can be really smart at times.
These days, Dubai has become something of a local hero.
People recognize him even today. He was asked to go to our fire station, which is just around the corner. They had an event for their children's burn center, and he was asked to come and introduced as the hero. I'm chopped liver, so I'm just the woman who has the dog. He's just a good boy.
Italy had learned to live with fear. By the spring of 1978, explosions, kidnappings, political assassinations, and ideological violence had become part of everyday conversation. Newspapers no longer asked whether another act of terrorism would occur, but where it would happen next and who would become its next victim. The country was passing through one of the darkest periods in its modern history, an era later remembered as the years of Lead. It was a time when political beliefs could determine friendships, divide neighborhoods, and, in the worst cases, decide who lived and who died. Against this backdrop, the disappearance of certainty became almost as frightening as violence itself. Every unanswered question left another wound in an already fractured society. Then came the morning of March 16, 1978. Former Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro was kidnapped by the Red Brigades, an event that instantly plunged the nation into crisis. Television broadcasts were interrupted. Newspapers printed special editions. Government officials scrambled to respond, while ordinary citizens watched with growing anxiety. Italy seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for whatever terrible event might come next. No one imagined that only 2 days later, another tragedy would unfold in Milan. Unlike the kidnapping of one of the country's most important political figures, this second crime would claim no cabinet minister, no police commander, and no famous public official. Instead, its victims would be 2 18-year-old friends whose names were known only to their families, classmates, and the young people who shared their ideals. Yet their deaths would become one of the most enduring mysteries of Italy's years of Lead. On the evening of March 18, 1978, Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci left the Leoncavallo Social Center, a place they regularly visited. Like many Saturdays before, there was nothing extraordinary about their plans. They intended to walk to Fausto's home for dinner. It was an ordinary routine, one repeated often enough that neither of them could have imagined it would be their last walk together. The streets of Milan carried the familiar sounds of a city settling into the evening. Cars moved through the intersections. Residents returned home. Shopkeepers prepared to close for the night. To anyone watching from a distance, the 2 young men would have appeared like countless other friends making their way through the Casaretto district. There was no visible indication that anyone was following them. There was no sign that the next minute would forever alter the history of an already troubled nation. At approximately 7:45 p.m., as they reached Via Mancinelli, 3 unknown men confronted them. Witnesses would later recall details that were striking precisely because of what they did not include. There was no heated argument. No shouting echoed down the street. No threats were exchanged. One of the attackers reportedly wore a light-colored jacket. More importantly, the men appeared to have been waiting. The encounter did not resemble a spontaneous confrontation or an argument that had suddenly turned violent. It looked, instead, like an ambush. Then the shooting began. Approximately 8 rounds were fired from a .32 caliber firearm at close range. The attack lasted less than a minute. It was swift, deliberate, and devastatingly precise. Lorenzo Iannucci collapsed almost immediately. His injuries were fatal. Fausto Tonelli, gravely wounded, was rushed toward a hospital. He never arrived alive. Within moments, 2 teenagers who had left a community center expecting nothing more remarkable than dinner with family had become victims of one of Italy's most infamous unsolved murders. The attackers escaped on motorcycles almost as quickly as they had appeared. During their flight, a firearm believed to belong to the group was left behind at the scene and later recovered by investigators. For detectives arriving shortly afterward, the evidence immediately suggested that this had not been a robbery gone wrong. Nothing had been stolen. There had been no attempt to intimidate the victims before the shooting. Every indication pointed toward careful preparation rather than sudden violence. The crime scene itself raised questions that would remain unanswered for decades. Why were these 2 young men targeted? Who had been waiting for them? Had the killers known exactly where Fausto and Io would walk that evening? Or had they spent hours observing their movements before choosing the perfect moment to strike? These questions would become the foundation of an investigation that stretched across generations, without producing a definitive judicial answer. In the days that followed, Italy was already consumed by the national emergency surrounding Aldo Moro. Yet the murders of Fausto and Io refused to disappear into the background. Their deaths occurred so soon after Moro's kidnapping that many people found the timing impossible to ignore. Whether coincidence or something more, the proximity of the 2 events ensured that the double homicide immediately attracted intense public attention. Speculation began almost immediately, but certainty remained elusive. Over the years, investigators would examine multiple possibilities. They would consider personal disputes. They would examine potential links to drugs. They would explore political motives and terrorism. Among these theories, one gradually emerged as the most prominent, that the murders were politically motivated, carried out during a period when ideological violence had become terrifyingly common. Soon after the killings, leaflets claiming responsibility appeared in the name of far-right extremist groups, including one identifying itself as NAR, Brigata Combatant Franco Anselmi. These claims attracted immediate attention, yet they failed to provide the proof necessary to establish responsibility in court. They deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. As years became decades, investigators identified individuals connected to far-right extremist networks as potential suspects. Their names appeared repeatedly throughout the investigation. Files accumulated. Testimonies were examined. Leads were pursued and abandoned. Although investigators believed there were significant indications pointing toward these individuals, the available evidence never reached the legal threshold required for prosecution or conviction. The case gradually stalled. In 2000, the investigation was suspended, not because every question had been answered, but because the evidence that remained could not support a successful criminal case. Other theories continued to circulate. One suggested that Fausto and Io had been gathering information about heroin trafficking in Milan, documenting drug distribution points and possible connections between organized crime and extremist groups. According to some journalists and independent investigators, Such work may have made them dangerous to powerful people. Yet this possibility remained exactly that, a theory. No evidence strong enough ever confirmed it as the motive behind the murders. Another hypothesis arose solely because of timing. Since the killings occurred only 2 days after Aldo Moro's abduction, some wondered whether the events were somehow connected. Suggestions emerged that Fausto might have known something related to an apartment connected with the Red Brigades, or that the murders were intended to divert public attention. These ideas generated discussion, but investigators ultimately found no reliable evidence establishing any direct link between the two cases. In the absence of definitive answers, the investigation itself gradually became part of the mystery. Advances in forensic science that later transformed criminal investigations could not recover evidence that had never been properly preserved. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and some physical evidence disappeared altogether. Among the losses frequently cited was a wool cap recovered at the crime scene that was never subjected to forensic examination before later disappearing from evidence storage. Such omissions became painful reminders that every unsolved case is also a race against time, and time rarely favors investigators. Yet despite decades of frustration, the story did not end. Nearly half a century after the murders, efforts by the victims' families and the authorities in Milan resulted in renewed attention to the case. In 2024, the Milan Public Prosecutor's Office reopened the file for review. In May 2025, a judge formally authorized a new investigation. Modern forensic techniques would once again be applied to surviving evidence. Investigators would re-examine the responsibility leaflets, reassess remaining physical evidence, and once more evaluate the possible role of far-right suspects. Even so, no court has yet established who killed Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Io Iannucci. No definitive judicial truth has emerged. Nearly 50 years after two friends left a social center expecting an ordinary Saturday evening, the central question remains unchanged. Who decided that two 18-year-old young men should die on a quiet street in Milan? This is not simply the story of an unsolved double homicide. It is the story of a nation struggling to distinguish truth from ideology, evidence from rumor, and justice from history. It is the story of two young lives cut short during one of Italy's darkest eras, and of an investigation that continues to remind us that some crimes leave behind more than victims. They leave behind questions that refuse to fade, no matter how many years pass. By the time 1978 arrived, Italy had become a country where uncertainty shaped daily life. Political disagreement no longer remained inside Parliament, newspaper editorials, or public debates. Increasingly, it spilled into the streets, where violence became a language spoken by competing extremist groups. The period would later become known as the Years of Lead, a name that reflected not only the bullets fired during countless attacks, but also the heavy atmosphere that settled across the nation. For ordinary Italians, fear gradually became routine. Every bombing, every assassination, every kidnapping reinforced the feeling that no one could predict where the next act of violence would occur. Families still went to work, students still attended school, and businesses continued operating. Yet beneath these ordinary routines lay the persistent awareness that the country itself seemed trapped in an escalating cycle of political confrontation. Right-wing terrorist organizations carried out violent attacks intended to intimidate political opponents and destabilize society. Left-wing extremist groups pursued their own campaigns of armed struggle, believing violence could transform the political order. Between them stood millions of ordinary citizens who wanted nothing more than stability but found themselves living in an era where headlines announcing another murder or bombing were no longer shocking. Instead, they became grim reminders that the crisis had not ended. The atmosphere was one in which suspicion spread almost as quickly as violence. Political affiliation influenced friendships, neighborhoods, workplaces, and universities. Public demonstrations frequently ended in clashes. Ideological labels carried enormous weight, often defining how individuals were viewed by others. The divisions within Italian society grew deeper with each passing year, creating an environment where acts of violence were increasingly interpreted through political lenses before investigators had even begun their work. It was within this tense national climate that one of the country's greatest political crises erupted. On March 16, 1978, former Prime Minister Aldo Moro was kidnapped by the Red Brigades. The event immediately dominated national attention. Moro was not merely a prominent politician. His abduction represented an attack on the Italian state itself, sending shockwaves through government institutions and the wider public. Newspapers devoted extensive coverage to the kidnapping, while television broadcasts focused almost entirely on developments in the investigation. Across the country, conversations revolved around the same questions. Where was Aldo Moro being held? Would he survive? Could the government negotiate with his captors? Italy entered a period of extraordinary tension. Every new rumor seemed capable of changing the national mood. Every hour without answers deepened uncertainty. Yet while the nation watched the unfolding Moro crisis, another tragedy was quietly approaching in Milan. Only 2 days after the kidnapping, 2 young men would lose their lives in a carefully executed attack that, although different in scale, would eventually become one of the enduring mysteries of the years of Lead. Their names were Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci. Neither occupied positions of political power. Neither commanded national attention before their deaths. They were both only 18 years old. Their lives had barely begun. Fausto Tonelli was born on November 25, 1959. He was a high school student and came from a working-class family. Like many young people of his generation, he had become involved in the social and political discussions that characterized Italy during the late 1970s. He regularly attended activities at the Leoncavallo Social Center in Milan, a place that attracted politically engaged young people interested in community life and activism. Although later investigations would closely examine his political environment, there is no indication in the available evidence that Fausto belonged to an armed organization. He was not a member of the Red Brigades or any comparable militant group. This distinction would remain important throughout the investigation because it separated his public identity from the violent organizations that dominated headlines during those years. Lorenzo Iannucci, known to friends simply as IIO, was born on September 29, 1959. Like Fausto, he was 18 years old at the time of his death. The two shared more than similar ages. They were close friends whose lives frequently intersected through their participation in the same social environment. IIO was also associated with the youthful left-wing movement active in Milan during the late 1970s. Like Fausto, however, he was not identified as a member of an armed terrorist organization. He represented a generation of politically engaged young Italians whose beliefs did not necessarily translate into participation in violent underground movements. Their friendship stood at the center of their story. They spent time together, attended Leoncavallo together, and on the evening of March 18, 1978, they walked together toward what should have been an ordinary family dinner. That shared journey would become their final one. The Leoncavallo Social Center occupied an important place in understanding the environment surrounding the two young men. It was where Fausto and IIO regularly participated in activities alongside other politically active youth. During the late 1970s, centers such as Leoncavallo served as gathering places where ideas, discussions, and community involvement intersected. Because of the broader political climate of the period, investigators naturally examined whether the social center itself held any significance in relation to the murders. The fact that both victims had left Leoncavallo shortly before the attack immediately drew investigative attention. Detectives needed to determine whether the location was merely the place from which the victims happened to depart that evening, or whether it formed part of a larger pattern connected to the crime. No definitive answer ever emerged. Nevertheless, Leoncavallo remained an important reference point throughout the investigation because it represented a central part of the victims' daily lives. Understanding Fausto and Iio also requires recognizing what they did not represent. During the years of lead, public perception often blurred distinctions between different segments of the political left. Individuals involved in legal activism could easily become associated, fairly or unfairly, with armed revolutionary organizations. In the case of Fausto and Iio, investigators consistently distinguished them from militant groups such as the Red Brigades. Their participation in youth activism did not equate to membership in terrorist organizations. This distinction is essential because many later theories attempted to explain their murders through the broader political conflicts consuming Italy at the time. Their age adds another dimension to the tragedy. 18 years old is an age generally associated with beginnings rather than endings. It is an age marked by education, friendships, ambitions, and the gradual transition into adulthood. For Fausto and Iio, those ordinary milestones would never arrive. Instead, their names became permanently linked to one of Italy's most debated unsolved political murders. Their youth also shaped public reaction. While Italy had witnessed numerous victims during the years of lead, the killing of two teenagers resonated deeply because it illustrated how political violence could reach beyond politicians, judges, police officers, and known militants. It demonstrated that young civilians involved in community activism could also become victims of an era defined by ideological conflict. The timing of their deaths intensified this perception because the murders occurred only 48 hours after Aldo Moro's kidnapping. Many observers found it difficult to view the two events in complete isolation. The nation was already overwhelmed by anxiety. Against that backdrop, the execution-style killing of two young activists inevitably fueled speculation. Investigators would later examine whether any meaningful connection existed between the events, but no reliable evidence ultimately established such a link. Still, the chronological proximity ensured that the murders of Fausto and Iio immediately entered public consciousness, not as an isolated crime, but as another chapter in an extraordinarily turbulent period of Italian history. Before the attack on Via Mancinelli, however, there was nothing publicly extraordinary about the lives of either victim. They were students. They maintained friendships. They participated in activities at Leoncavallo. They belonged to a generation attempting to define its place within a society experiencing profound political division. Their backgrounds contained none of the notoriety often associated with major criminal cases. It was only after their deaths that every aspect of their lives became subject to careful examination by investigators searching for a motive. Friends, routines, political associations, and daily habits all acquired new significance as detectives attempted to understand why these two particular young men had been selected. Yet despite decades of investigation, none of those examinations produced a definitive explanation. What remains certain is remarkably simple. On the afternoon of March 18, 1978, Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci spent time at the Leoncavallo Social Center, a place familiar to them both. Later that evening, they left together intending to walk to Fausto's home for dinner, following what appears to have been an entirely ordinary plan. They never arrived. Everything known about the investigation, every theory explored over the following decades, every judicial review, and every renewed inquiry begins with those ordinary facts. Two young friends, living in an extraordinary period of Italian history, unknowingly stepped into the final chapter of their lives. Their deaths would eventually come to symbolize not only the brutality of the years of Lead, but also the enduring frustration of a society still searching for answers that the passage of nearly half a century has failed to provide. The afternoon of March 18th, 1978 began without any indication that it would become one of the most discussed days in the history of Italy's years of Lead. For Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci, it was a Saturday, a familiar point in the week when routines offered a sense of normality despite the political tension surrounding the country. Like many other young people involved in the social life of Milan, they spent part of the day at the Leoncavallo Social Center. It was a place they knew well, one where they regularly participated in activities alongside others who shared similar interests in political engagement. Nothing contained in the available evidence suggests that their behavior that afternoon differed from previous Saturdays. There were no reported confrontations, no indications that they believed they were being watched, and no evidence that they anticipated danger. To them, the day appears to have unfolded as countless others had before it. As the afternoon gradually gave way to evening, Fausto and Io prepared to leave Leoncavallo. Their destination was simple. They intended to walk to Fausto's home for dinner, following what had become a familiar routine. There was nothing unusual about the plan. It did not require a complicated journey or an unexpected detour. They would simply leave the social center, walk through the Casaretto district of Milan, and arrive at Fausto's home. Such an ordinary plan makes the events that followed even more difficult to comprehend. Violent crimes often emerge from escalating arguments, personal disputes, or moments of visible confrontation. Yet everything known about this case suggests the opposite. The victims were not drawn into an argument. They were not involved in a public altercation. Instead, they appear to have walked directly into an ambush that had already been prepared before they ever reached the scene. At approximately 7:45 p.m., the two 18-year-olds left Leoncavallo together. The streets of Milan continue to function as they normally would on an early Saturday evening. Residents moved through the neighborhood. Vehicles passed along nearby roads. Homes were beginning to fill with families gathering for dinner. From every outward appearance, Fausto and Io were simply two friends making the short journey toward home. There is no evidence that they changed their route unexpectedly or that they realized anyone was waiting for them. Their movements appear to have been predictable enough that, if someone had intended to attack them, knowing where and when they would pass would not have required improvisation. Eventually, they reached Via Mancinelli, a street in Milan's Casaretto district. It was here that the ordinary rhythm of the evening ended. According to witness accounts gathered during the investigation, 3 unidentified men confronted the two friends. The available testimony contains several details that investigators considered particularly significant. One of the attackers reportedly wore a light-colored jacket. More importantly, witnesses did not describe any argument preceding the violence. There was no shouting that might suggest an emotional confrontation. There were no threats exchanged between the victims and the attackers. There was no visible attempt to provoke a fight. Instead, the encounter appears to have begun and ended with startling speed. Investigators concluded that the attackers seemed to have been waiting. This observation became one of the earliest indications that the crime had been carefully planned, rather than occurring spontaneously. If the 3 men were already positioned on Via Mancinelli before Fausto and Io arrived, then the victims' movements may have been known in advance. Whether the attackers had followed them from Leoncavallo or simply anticipated their route remains unknown. The available evidence cannot answer that question. What it does suggest is that the confrontation itself was never intended to become a conversation. It was intended to become an execution. The shooting began almost immediately. Approximately 8 rounds were fired from a .32 caliber firearm at close range. The number of shots alone indicated determination. This was not a single impulsive discharge of a weapon. It was a sustained burst of gunfire directed at 2 specific individuals. The close distance between attackers and victims increased the likelihood that the shooters intended to ensure the attack succeeded. The precision of the gunfire later became one of the factors leading investigators to believe the killers had arrived with a clear objective rather than acting in panic or confusion. Every second unfolded with devastating efficiency. Lorenzo Io Iannucci suffered fatal injuries and died almost immediately at the scene. His life ended before emergency assistance could meaningfully intervene. Beside him, Fausto Tonelli remained alive, but critically wounded. The injuries he sustained were severe enough that immediate medical treatment became essential. Emergency responders transported him toward a hospital, but despite those efforts, he died before reaching medical care. Within less than a minute, 2 young men who had left Leoncavallo expecting an ordinary evening had become victims of one of Italy's most enduring unsolved murders. The attackers wasted no time remaining at the scene. Once the shooting was complete, they fled using motorcycles. Their escape was rapid enough that no immediate pursuit resulted in arrests. Yet amid the speed of their departure, investigators recovered one potentially significant piece of evidence. During the escape, a firearm believed to belong to the attackers was left behind and later taken into police custody. In many homicide investigations, the recovery of a weapon can represent a crucial breakthrough. Ballistic analysis, fingerprints, ownership records, or other forensic techniques may connect a firearm to suspects or previous crimes. In this case, however, the available evidence would ultimately prove insufficient to identify those responsible. Even the recovery of a suspected murder weapon failed to resolve the central mystery. As police secure the crime scene, several observations immediately distinguish the attack from other forms of violent crime. First, there was no indication that robbery had motivated the shooting. None of the available evidence suggested that the attackers had attempted to steal money or personal belongings. The victims had not been targeted for financial gain. Second, there had been no verbal warning before the shooting began. The attackers did not announce themselves, threaten the victims, or demand cooperation. The absence of dialogue implied that communication had never been their purpose. Their objective appears to have been killing, not intimidation. Third, investigators noted the accuracy of the attack. Approximately 8 shots fired at close range produced precisely the outcome the attackers appeared to seek. The speed, precision, and coordination displayed during the assault strongly suggested preparation. Finally, the entire encounter lasted less than 1 minute. Such brevity left little opportunity for intervention by passers-by or nearby residents. These observations collectively shaped the earliest investigative conclusions. Detectives quickly began to view the murders not as the result of a spontaneous dispute, but as a carefully organized ambush. Every observable feature of the attack pointed toward planning. The victims had been intercepted at a specific location. The attackers arrived in sufficient numbers to ensure control of the situation. The shooting itself was direct and efficient. The escape had apparently been organized in advance through the use of motorcycles. No aspect of the available evidence suggested confusion or improvisation. Instead, the operation reflected preparation and intent. Yet the precision of the crime also created extraordinary difficulties for investigators. Because the attackers completed the assault so quickly, witnesses had limited opportunities to observe identifying characteristics. The description of one assailant wearing a light-colored jacket offered investigators only a modest starting point. The attackers' identities remained unknown. Their route of escape could not immediately be reconstructed with certainty. Every unanswered question at the crime scene would later become another obstacle during the investigation. As emergency personnel completed their work and detectives documented the evidence, another reality became impossible to ignore. The murders had occurred only 2 days after the kidnapping of Aldo Moro. Italy was already immersed in one of the most significant political crises of the post-war era. Against this national backdrop, the execution-style killing of 2 politically active young men inevitably invited speculation about motive, even before investigators had fully processed the physical evidence. Public attention increasingly focused on whether the murders reflected the broader ideological conflict consuming the country. At that early stage, however, detectives could not afford assumptions. The crime scene itself offered only physical facts. 2 victims. Approximately 8 shots fired from a .32 caliber firearm. 3 unidentified attackers. No robbery. No argument. A firearm recovered after the killers fled on motorcycles. Beyond those facts lay only questions. Who had selected Via Mancinelli as the location for the ambush? Had the attackers observed the victims for days? Or had they simply known the route Fausto and Io routinely followed? Was the location chosen because it offered an efficient escape, or because the killers believed it provided the ideal opportunity to strike? None of these questions could be answered by the evidence collected that evening. They would instead become central themes throughout decades of investigation. As night settled over Milan, the immediate consequences extended far beyond the crime scene itself. 2 families suddenly faced unimaginable loss. Friends and classmates struggled to understand how an ordinary Saturday had ended in tragedy. The Leoncavallo Social Center, where the victims had spent part of the afternoon, instantly became linked to a murder that would dominate public discussion for years. Investigators began assembling the first pieces of what would become an extraordinarily complex case. While journalists reported that another shocking act of violence had occurred during an already terrifying period in Italian history. Yet despite the attention the murders immediately received, the fundamental truth remained painfully simple. 2 18-year-old friends had set out together, expecting nothing more remarkable than dinner. They never reached their destination. Everything that followed, the competing theories, the extensive investigations, the public debate, the decades of unanswered questions, and the eventual reopening of the case, began with those few tragic moments on Via Mancinelli, where an ordinary evening was transformed into one of Italy's most enduring unsolved mysteries. The murders of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Io Iannucci immediately confronted investigators with a difficult reality. The crime scene strongly suggested that the attack had been carefully organized, yet it revealed remarkably little about the identities of those responsible. Detectives arriving on Via Mancinelli found no signs of robbery, no evidence of a spontaneous confrontation, and no indication that the shooting had resulted from a chance encounter. Instead, everything pointed toward a targeted ambush carried out with precision. 2 young men had been intercepted while walking home. Approximately 8 rounds from a .32 caliber firearm had been fired at close range, and the attackers had escaped in less than a minute. Although a firearm believed to belong to the assailants had been recovered after being left behind during their escape, identifying the people who had carried out the attack would prove far more complicated than recovering a single piece of physical evidence. From the very beginning, investigators refused to focus exclusively on one explanation. As with any major homicide investigation, detectives first attempted to establish every plausible motive before narrowing their attention. The earliest inquiries explored several possible directions. Investigators examined whether either victim had been involved in a personal dispute that could have escalated into violence. They considered whether private conflicts, unknown to friends or family, might explain why the two young men have been targeted. At the same time, detectives also evaluated whether the murders could have been connected to criminal activity involving illegal drugs. Finally, they examined the possibility that the attack had emerged from the broader political violence engulfing Italy during the years of lead, including potential links to terrorism. At this initial stage, no possibility could be dismissed without examination. Every investigative path demanded attention because every unanswered question represented another obstacle to discovering who had carried out the murders. Yet, as detectives reconstructed the events of March 18, 1978, one particular explanation gradually began to outweigh the others. The characteristics of the attack itself appeared inconsistent with an impulsive act of violence. There had been no argument before the shooting. There had been no attempt to rob the victims. The assailants appeared to have been waiting in advance, suggesting prior knowledge of the victims' movements. Their escape had also been organized, relying on motorcycles to leave the scene immediately after the shooting. These factors collectively encouraged investigators to view the crime as a planned operation rather than a personal dispute, because Italy was already experiencing widespread ideological violence. The possibility of a politically motivated assassination increasingly became the dominant investigative theory. This shift in focus gained additional momentum almost immediately after the murders. Shortly following the attack, investigators became aware that several leaflets had appeared claiming responsibility for the killings. These documents were distributed in the name of far-right extremist organizations, including one identifying itself as NAR, Brigata Combatant Franco Anselmi. In many criminal investigations, a public claim of responsibility can represent an important lead. Such communications may reveal details known only to perpetrators, provide information about motives, or establish connections between suspects and the crime itself. However, investigators understood that not every claim should automatically be accepted as genuine. During periods of political violence, organizations sometimes claimed responsibility for crimes they had not committed, either to increase their reputation, spread fear, or advance ideological objectives. Consequently, detectives treated the leaflets with caution. They recognized their potential importance, but also understood that the documents alone could not establish criminal responsibility. A written claim, regardless of its source, could not substitute for admissible evidence capable of identifying individual perpetrators. Even so, the appearance of the leaflets significantly influenced the direction of the investigation. Detectives increasingly concentrated on individuals associated with far-right extremist networks, active during the years of lead. As the inquiry developed, 3 names emerged repeatedly within investigative files: Massimo Carminati, Mario Corsi, and Claudio Bracci. Each had connections to far-right circles operating during the period. Their associations placed them within the scope of the investigation because detectives believed it necessary to determine whether any relationship existed between these individuals and the murders of Fausto and Igel. It is important to distinguish, however, between investigative suspicion and judicial proof. Throughout the inquiry, authorities reported that there were significant investigative indications concerning these individuals. Nevertheless, indications alone are not equivalent to evidence capable of sustaining criminal convictions. Every legal system demands proof meeting established standards before a court can determine guilt. In this case, investigators never obtained sufficient evidence to prosecute or convict any of the suspects. As a result, despite years of examination, no judicial finding established that any of these individuals committed the murders. Their names remained associated with the investigation, but the case itself remained unresolved. While the political motive increasingly occupied investigators' attention, Detectives continued examining additional theories that might explain why the two young men had been targeted. One of the most discussed alternative hypotheses concerned heroin trafficking in Milan. According to this investigative theory, Fausto and IIO may have been gathering information regarding heroin distribution within the city. The alleged material reportedly concerned drug distribution points, individuals involved in trafficking, and possible connections between criminal organizations and certain extremist groups. According to some journalists and independent investigators, the existence of such information might have provided a motive for eliminating the two young men before their work became more widely known. This theory attracted attention because it appeared capable of explaining why individuals with no established membership in armed terrorist organizations could nevertheless become victims of a professionally executed assassination. If accurate, it would suggest that the murders arose not solely from ideological conflict, but from an intersection between organized crime and political extremism. Yet investigators ultimately faced the same obstacle that confronted many other aspects of the case. Despite discussion surrounding the alleged heroin investigation, no evidence sufficiently strong ever established that it constituted the motive behind the killings. The hypothesis remained part of the investigative record, but it never advanced beyond the level of possibility. Detectives also examined another theory born almost entirely from chronology. The murders occurred only 2 days after the kidnapping of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro by the Red Brigades, because both events unfolded within such an extraordinarily short period. Speculation inevitably emerged regarding a possible connection. Some hypotheses suggested that Fausto might have possessed knowledge concerning an apartment associated with the Red Brigades. Others proposed that the murders may have been intended to divert public attention during the unfolding Moro crisis. These ideas attracted interest largely because of the extraordinary political atmosphere prevailing in Italy at the time. The coincidence of timing seemed remarkable. However, investigators repeatedly emphasized that coincidence alone could not establish causation. Throughout the investigation, authorities searched for evidence capable of demonstrating a direct relationship between the two cases. Ultimately, no reliable evidence emerged to support these hypotheses. Although the timing remained striking, the investigation failed to identify factual material linking the murders of Fausto and IIO directly to Aldo Moro's kidnapping. As months turned into years, the investigation encountered increasingly difficult challenges. Every criminal inquiry depends not only upon discovering evidence, but also upon preserving it. In the case of Fausto and IIO, several factors gradually undermined investigators' ability to establish definitive conclusions. One important limitation involved the forensic standards available during the late 1970s. Investigative techniques that later became standard in homicide cases were either unavailable or significantly less advanced at the time. Consequently, opportunities that might have produced decisive evidence decades later were sometimes lost during the earliest stages of the inquiry. Time itself became another adversary. Witnesses who initially recalled details eventually struggled to remember events with the same clarity. Human memory naturally changes over decades, particularly when attempting to reconstruct brief moments observed under stressful circumstances. Small inconsistencies emerged, while certain details faded altogether. Even honest witnesses found it increasingly difficult to distinguish precise recollections from memories influenced by years of public discussion surrounding the case. Physical evidence also presented serious difficulties. Among the most frequently cited problems was the disappearance of a wool cap recovered at the crime scene. According to later accounts of the investigation, the cap was never subjected to forensic examination before it disappeared from evidence storage. Had modern forensic techniques been available, or had the item remained preserved, it might have yielded information impossible to obtain elsewhere. Instead, its disappearance became one of the most frequently discussed examples of opportunities that could never be recovered. The investigation thus suffered not only from the absence of conclusive evidence, but also from the irreversible loss of material that might once have proven valuable. These cumulative obstacles gradually transformed the investigation from an active pursuit into a case constrained by the limits of available proof. Detectives continued evaluating witness testimony, examining political connections, reviewing extremist organizations, and assessing every plausible motive. Nevertheless, each avenue eventually encountered the same barrier. Suspicion existed. Questions remained. Certain investigative indications appeared significant. Yet none of these elements, individually or collectively, satisfied the legal standards necessary to identify the killers beyond reasonable doubt. By the year 2000, after more than 2 decades of investigation, authorities suspended the case. The decision did not indicate that investigators believed the mystery had been solved, nor did it suggest that every lead had been exhausted. Rather, it reflected the reality that the available evidence could no longer support further criminal proceedings. The case had reached a point where suspicion exceeded proof, and the justice system could not proceed without evidence capable of withstanding judicial scrutiny. For the families of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci, this outcome offered little comfort. The absence of convictions did not erase the facts established on Via Mancinelli. 2 18-year-old friends had been deliberately killed in what investigators consistently regarded as a planned attack. Yet the identities of those responsible remained legally unproven. The investigation itself became part of the tragedy, illustrating how even determined police work can be limited by missing evidence, fading memories, and the forensic capabilities of its era. Decades later, these unresolved questions would eventually encourage authorities to reopen the investigation using modern techniques. But during the original inquiry, every major investigative path, from political extremism to heroin trafficking, from claims of responsibility to possible connections with the Aldo Moro crisis, ultimately arrived at the same destination. None produced the conclusive evidence required to answer the central question that had haunted Italy since the evening of March 18, 1978. Who planned the ambush on Via Mancinelli? And why were Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci chosen as its victims? Unlike many criminal cases that culminate in dramatic courtroom testimony, decisive verdicts, or public confessions, the legal history of the murders of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci is defined by something far less satisfying. It is the history of a case that repeatedly approached the possibility of judicial resolution, without ever crossing the threshold required by law. For investigators, prosecutors, and the victims' families, the challenge was never a lack of theories. Over the years, numerous investigative directions were explored, and several individuals became subjects of sustained scrutiny. The difficulty lay elsewhere. Every legal system demands that suspicion be transformed into evidence capable of proving guilt, beyond the standard required in court. In the case of Fausto and Iannucci, that transformation never occurred. As a result, the judicial process became less a story of prosecution and conviction than a long struggle between strong investigative suspicions and the strict evidentiary requirements that define criminal justice. During the years following the murders, prosecutors worked alongside investigators to evaluate the material gathered throughout the inquiry. Witness statements, forensic findings available at the time, physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, the firearm believed to have belonged to the attackers, claims of responsibility distributed after the murders, and information concerning individuals connected to far-right extremist networks all became part of the growing investigative record. The names of Massimo Carminati, Mario Corsi, and Claudio Bracci repeatedly appeared within the investigation because of their alleged connections to extremist circles active during the years of lead. Detectives considered these investigative leads significant enough to justify extensive examination. Yet significance within an investigation is not equivalent to admissible proof before court. Prosecutors were required to determine not only whether suspicions existed, but whether those suspicions could be supported by reliable evidence capable of surviving judicial scrutiny. Throughout the investigation, that distinction remained decisive. Italian criminal procedure, like the criminal justice systems of many democratic nations, does not permit convictions based solely upon probability, reputation, or investigative belief. Evidence must demonstrate responsibility according to legal standards established to protect both victims and defendants. Consequently, even when investigators believed certain individuals deserved careful attention, prosecutors could not proceed successfully without evidence sufficient to establish individual criminal responsibility. In this case, that evidentiary threshold proved impossible to reach. The claims of responsibility distributed in the name of NAR, Brigata Combatant Franco Anselmi, presented one example of this problem. While the leaflets naturally attracted immediate investigative interest, they could not by themselves identify who had actually committed the murders. Investigators understood that extremist organizations sometimes claimed responsibility for violent acts regardless of their actual involvement. Without independent evidence confirming the authenticity of the claims or identifying the specific perpetrators, the documents remained important investigative material, but not conclusive judicial proof. Likewise, the investigation into suspected far-right extremists produced what authorities described as significant investigative indications. However, indications, regardless of how compelling they may appear during an investigation, cannot substitute for evidence satisfying the legal burden required for prosecution and conviction. This distinction frustrated many observers, particularly because the broader political climate encouraged speculation that the perpetrators had already been identified informally, even if they could not be convicted formally. Yet the justice system cannot operate according to speculation. Courts require evidence that can be examined, challenged, and tested through legal procedures. In the absence of such evidence, suspicion remains suspicion regardless of its apparent strength. Other investigative theories encountered similar limitations. The hypothesis suggesting that Fausto and IAIO had collected information concerning heroin trafficking in Milan attracted attention because it appeared capable of explaining why too young activists might become targets of organized violence. According to this theory, they may have documented heroin distribution points, individuals involved in trafficking, and possible links between criminal organizations and extremist groups. Nevertheless, prosecutors faced the same fundamental obstacle encountered elsewhere in the investigation. No evidence sufficiently established that this alleged activity had actually motivated the murders. Without corroborating proof connecting the victims' alleged research directly to the attack, the theory could not serve as the basis for criminal proceedings. The hypothesis remained part of the investigative record rather than an established judicial finding. The proposed connection to the kidnapping of Aldo Moro also failed to produce evidence capable of supporting legal action, because the murders occurred only 2 days after Moro's abduction. Speculation concerning possible links proved unavoidable. Investigators explored suggestions that Fausto might have known something regarding an apartment connected to the Red Brigades, or that the murders may have served as a diversion during the national crisis. Yet after examining these possibilities, authorities found no reliable evidence demonstrating a direct relationship between the two events. Consequently, this line of inquiry likewise failed to advance toward prosecution. As years passed, prosecutors faced another increasingly serious obstacle: the gradual deterioration of the available evidence. Witnesses naturally found it more difficult to remember precise details as decades elapsed. Memories that may initially have appeared clear inevitably became less certain with time. Physical evidence also presented difficulties. The disappearance of the wool cap recovered at the crime scene became one of the most frequently discussed examples of investigative opportunities lost forever, because the item had never undergone forensic examination before disappearing from evidence storage. Any information it might once have contained became permanently inaccessible. Advances in forensic science that transformed homicide investigations during subsequent decades could not recover evidence that no longer existed or had never been preserved according to later standards. These cumulative problems gradually reduced prosecutors' ability to move the investigation toward court proceedings. Every potential suspect required evidence directly connecting that individual to the murders. Every investigative theory required proof capable of demonstrating motive and participation. Every piece of physical evidence required reliability sufficient to withstand legal examination. One by one, the available investigative paths reached the same conclusion. Questions remained abundant, but legally admissible answers remained scarce. Eventually, in the year 2000, authorities suspended the investigation. This decision has sometimes been misunderstood as representing closure. In reality, it reflected the opposite. The suspension acknowledged that investigators had been unable to assemble sufficient evidence to continue pursuing criminal proceedings successfully. The murders themselves remained unsolved. No court declared the mystery resolved. No judicial authority identified the killers through a final verdict. Instead, the legal process reached a point where continuing without additional evidence no longer appeared possible. For the families of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci, the suspension represented neither justice nor finality. It simply marked another stage in an already lengthy search for answers. Their loss remained unchanged regardless of the procedural status of the investigation. Public interest also persisted. The murders had become one of the defining unsolved crimes associated with the years of lead, ensuring that historians, journalists, independent researchers, and members of the public continued discussing the case long after formal investigative activity had slowed. As decades passed, advances in forensic science gradually transformed criminal investigations around the world. Evidence once considered unusable could sometimes be re-examined using techniques unavailable when the original crimes occurred. At the same time, renewed public interest in unresolved historical cases encouraged prosecutors to reconsider investigations that had previously reached procedural dead ends. The case of Fausto and Io eventually benefited from both developments. After years of advocacy by the victims' families and support from the authorities of the city of Milan, the possibility of reopening the investigation received renewed attention. In 2024, the Milan Public Prosecutor's Office reopened the case file for review. This development did not indicate that investigators had already discovered the identity of the killers. Rather, it reflected the belief that surviving evidence deserved fresh examination using contemporary investigative methods. The following year marked another important procedural milestone. In May 2025, a judge formally authorized the reopening of the investigation, nearly half a century after the murders. The legal system once again began examining whether unanswered questions from 1978 might finally produce meaningful answers. Prosecutors identified several priorities for the renewed inquiry. They planned to analyze once again the leaflets claiming responsibility by applying modern forensic techniques unavailable during the original investigation. Remaining physical evidence would also undergo renewed evaluation wherever possible. Investigators further intended to reassess the potential involvement of suspects connected to far-right extremist networks in light of all surviving material contained within the historical investigative record. The reopening demonstrated an important principle of criminal justice. The passage of time does not necessarily eliminate the possibility of further investigation, particularly when serious crimes remain unsolved. Nevertheless, reopening an investigation should not be confused with solving it. Although the renewed inquiry reflected optimism that modern techniques might reveal information previously inaccessible, it did not alter the current legal status of the case. As matters stand today, no individual has been convicted for the murders of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci. No court has established a definitive judicial reconstruction identifying the perpetrators or determining their precise motive. The case therefore remains legally unresolved despite decades of investigation and renewed prosecutorial efforts. This legal outcome is perhaps the most remarkable feature of the entire case. Nearly 50 years have passed since two 18-year-old friends were ambushed while walking home through the streets of Milan. Investigators explored multiple theories, examined extremist organizations, reviewed allegations involving heroin trafficking, considered possible connections to the political crisis surrounding Aldo Moro, and identified individuals whose activities warranted extensive scrutiny. Yet throughout every stage of the judicial process, one principle consistently prevailed. Suspicion alone could not replace proof. Regardless of the strength of investigative belief, courts require evidence meeting legal standards before responsibility can be assigned through criminal conviction. In the absence of such evidence, justice remains incomplete. The reopening of the investigation in 2025, therefore, represents not the conclusion of the legal story, but its continuation. It acknowledges both the extraordinary persistence of those seeking answers and the enduring possibility that modern investigative methods may still contribute to understanding one of Italy's most enduring unsolved political murders. Whether those renewed efforts will ultimately produce the judicial certainty that has remained absent for nearly half a century remains unknown. What is known is that the legal process surrounding the murders of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci has never produced the definitive courtroom conclusion that so many hoped would finally answer the questions first raised on Via Mancinelli on the evening of March 18, 1978. Nearly half a century has passed since the evening of March 18, 1978. Yet the names Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci continue to occupy a unique place in the history of modern Italy. Many criminal investigations eventually reach a point where the facts become settled. A court identifies the perpetrators, establishes the motive, and delivers a verdict that, while it may never erase the pain experienced by the victims' families, at least provides a legal conclusion. The murders of Fausto and Io never reached that point. Instead, the case entered history as one of the defining unresolved crimes of the years of lead. Remembered not only because two 18-year-old friends lost their lives, but because their deaths came to symbolize the broader uncertainty of an era in which violence often outpaced justice. For their families, the passage of time could never diminish the absence left behind. Every anniversary represented more than the remembrance of a tragic event. It marked another year without definitive answers. The ordinary expectations that every family holds for young people, the hope of watching them complete their education, begin careers, build relationships, and grow older, ended forever on Via Mancinelli. The legal uncertainty that followed could not alter that reality. Whether investigators examined political extremism, organized crime, or other possible motives, The central fact remained unchanged. Two young men left the Leon Cavallo Social Center expecting to share dinner with family. Neither returned home. That simple truth has remained constant through every stage of the investigation. Their deaths also became part of Italy's collective historical memory. The years of lead produced many victims, including politicians, judges, police officers, journalists, and ordinary citizens. Yet the story of Fausto and Iaio continues to resonate because it reflects how political violence extended far beyond public institutions. The victims were not government officials protected by security details. They were not nationally recognized political leaders. They were students. They were friends. They belonged to a generation that had grown up amid intense political division and social unrest. Yet there is no evidence that either belonged to armed organizations such as the Red Brigades. Their murders demonstrated that the boundaries separating ideological conflict from everyday civilian life had become dangerously fragile. The attack itself reinforced that impression. Investigators concluded early that the shooting bore the characteristics of a carefully planned ambush. There was no robbery. There was no argument. Approximately 8 shots were fired at close range before the attackers escaped on motorcycles. Every observable feature suggested preparation rather than spontaneity. Yet despite those indications, the investigation never produced sufficient evidence to establish criminal responsibility before a court. As a result, the murders became not only a symbol of political violence, but also an example of the limitations that investigators sometimes confront when evidence, however suggestive, fails to satisfy legal standards. The years that followed illustrated another painful reality about unresolved criminal cases. Time rarely works in favor of those searching for answers. Witnesses age, memories fade, physical evidence deteriorates or disappears. Investigative opportunities available immediately after a crime can rarely be recreated decades later. In the case of Fausto and Iaio, these difficulties became especially apparent. Later discussions frequently emphasized the limitations of forensic procedures available during the late 1970s. The gradual loss of witness recollections and the disappearance of physical evidence, including the wool cap recovered at the crime scene that was never subjected to forensic examination before it was lost from evidence storage. Each of these factors represented more than an isolated procedural problem. Together, they illustrated how the passage of time can transform unanswered questions into permanent mysteries. Yet despite those obstacles, the case refused to disappear entirely. Public interest endured because the murders occupied an important place within the broader history of the years of lead. Journalists, historians, independent researchers, and the victims' families continued returning to the unanswered questions surrounding Via Mancinelli. Their persistence reflected an important principle shared by many societies confronting unresolved historical crimes. Justice is not measured solely by convictions. It is also measured by the willingness to continue searching for the truth, even when success appears uncertain. That persistence ultimately contributed to renewed legal attention decades later. The decision by the Milan Public Prosecutor's Office in 2024 to reopen the case for review, followed by judicial authorization in May 2025, demonstrated that unresolved crimes need not remain permanently frozen in the past. Advances in forensic science, combined with renewed examination of surviving evidence, created the possibility that questions once considered impossible to answer might deserve another investigation. Whether those renewed efforts will eventually produce definitive conclusions remains unknown. Nevertheless, the reopening itself carries symbolic significance. It acknowledges that the search for truth did not end when the original investigation was suspended in 2000. Instead, It recognizes that justice sometimes requires patience measured not in months or years, but in generations. Even today, however, the legal position remains unchanged. No individual has been convicted of murdering Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Aio Iannucci. Investigators have examined numerous theories. They considered possible political motives, including claims of responsibility attributed to far-right extremist groups, such as NAR, Brigada Combatant Franco Anselmi. They investigated individuals connected with extremist networks, including Massimo Carminati, Mario Corsi, and Claudio Bracci, while emphasizing that the available evidence never reached the legal threshold required for prosecution or conviction. They explored the hypothesis that the victims may have been gathering information concerning heroin trafficking and possible links between organized crime and extremist groups. But no evidence sufficiently confirmed this theory as the motive behind the murders. They also considered whether the extraordinary timing of the killings, occurring only 2 days after Aldo Moro's kidnapping, suggested some broader connection. Yet investigators ultimately found no reliable evidence supporting such a relationship. Consequently, every major investigative path produced questions, possibilities, and significant indications, but none produced the definitive proof necessary for judicial certainty. This distinction remains essential when reflecting upon the case today. History often remembers unresolved crimes through rumor, speculation, or popular narratives that gradually harden into assumed truths. The story of Fausto and Aio serves as an important reminder that historical memory must distinguish between established fact and investigative hypothesis. It is known that 2 young men were ambushed and killed on Via Mancinelli on March 18, 1978. It is known that the attack appeared carefully planned. It is known that investigators explored multiple theories over several decades. It is also known that no court has established who committed the murders or why. Everything beyond those conclusions must continue to be treated with the caution demanded by both history and justice. Perhaps that is why this case continues to resonate nearly 50 years later. It is not simply because it remains unsolved. Many criminal investigations remain unresolved. Rather, it is because the murders of Fausto and Aio encapsulate so many defining characteristics of the years of lead. Ideological conflict, political suspicion, public fear, competing narratives, and the enduring difficulty of separating certainty from speculation. The case stands as a reminder that periods of political violence often leave behind more than immediate victims. They also leave unanswered questions capable of shaping public memory for decades. Looking back today, the image that remains most powerful is not necessarily the investigation, the political theories, or the legal proceedings. It is the ordinary simplicity of the final hours before the attack. 2 18-year-old friends spent part of a Saturday afternoon at a place they knew well. As evening approached, they began walking toward a family dinner. Nothing within the available evidence suggests they expected danger. Nothing indicates they believed their routine journey would become the final minutes of their lives. The contrast between that ordinary beginning and its tragic ending continues to define the emotional weight of the case. Via Mancinelli still exists. Milan has changed dramatically since 1978. Italy itself has changed. The years of lead have become history rather than daily reality. New generations walk the same streets without experiencing the atmosphere of fear that once dominated the country. Yet history leaves traces that are not always visible in buildings or monuments. Sometimes those traces survive in unanswered questions carried forward through time. The names Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Aio Iannucci remain among those traces, reminding Italy of an era when violence reached into the lives of ordinary young people and when justice proved more difficult to achieve than anyone could have imagined. nearly half a century after the gunfire faded on Via Mancinelli. The investigation continues to seek what the original inquiry could not provide. A definitiva judicial truce. Until that day arrives, if it ever does, the story of Fausto and Io remains unfinished. It is the story of two friends whose lives ended in less than a minute, of families who have waited decades for answers, of investigators who pursued every available lead within the limits of the evidence, and of a nation that continues to remember them, not because their case has been solved, but because it has not. In the end, the greatest lesson of the Fausto and Io case is not about ideology, politics, or even criminal investigation. It is about the value of truth itself. Justice depends upon facts rather than assumptions, evidence rather than rumor, and patience rather than certainty born of speculation. The search for that truth has lasted far longer than anyone could have imagined on the evening of March 1978. Whether the renewed investigation will finally answer the questions that have endured for generations remains uncertain. What is certain is that Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo O. Iannucci should be remembered first not as symbols, not as political figures, and not merely as names in an unsolved case file, but as two young men whose futures ended long before they had the chance to become the people they might have been. Their story endures because history has not yet finished asking the question that first emerged on a quiet street in Milan nearly 50 years ago. Who took those futures away and why? Until a definitive answer is established through evidence and the law, that question remains one of the most enduring mysteries of Italy's years of lead. Nearly 5 decades have passed since the evening when Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo O. Iannucci walked away from the Leoncavallo Social Center. Yet the silence surrounding their deaths remains as striking as the gunfire that ended their lives. Most criminal investigations eventually produce a conclusion, even if that conclusion is controversial. Some end with convictions that withstand decades of appeals. Others end with acquittals after courts determine that the evidence cannot establish guilt. Still others conclude when investigators identify a suspect who can no longer stand trial. The story of Fausto and Io belongs to none of those categories. Instead, it exists in the difficult space between suspicion and certainty, between historical memory and judicial proof. It is remembered because it refuses to offer the sense of closure that both families and societies often seek after acts of violence. Every year that passes without a definitive legal answer transforms the murders from a criminal investigation into a historical question that each new generation must confront. The case has therefore become larger than the tragic deaths of two 18-year-old friends. It has become a reflection of the challenges faced by every justice system when crimes occur during periods of political turmoil, when evidence is incomplete, when time gradually erodes memories, and when the search for truth must compete against the passage of decades. Looking back across the investigation from the perspective of today reveals a remarkable pattern. The fundamental facts have remained unchanged since the evening of March 18, 1978. Two young men left the Leoncavallo Social Center after spending the afternoon there. Their destination was Fausto's home, where they intended to have dinner. At approximately 7:45 p.m., while walking along Via Mancinelli in Milan's Casaretto district, they were confronted by 3 unidentified men. There was no reported argument, no robbery, and no warning. Approximately 8 shots from a .32 caliber firearm were fired at close range. Io died almost immediately. Fausto died while being transported to the hospital. The attackers escaped on motorcycles, leaving behind a firearm believed to have belonged to them. Those facts have never fundamentally changed despite decades of investigation. Everything that followed involved the effort to explain why those events occurred and who carried them out. That effort would prove far more difficult than anyone could have imagined during the first hours. After the murders, one of the reasons this case continues to attract attention is the extraordinary historical moment in which it occurred. Only 2 days earlier, Aldo Moro had been kidnapped by the Red Brigades, placing Italy in one of the greatest political crises of the post-war era. The country was already consumed by anxiety, uncertainty, and fear. Against that backdrop, the execution-style killing of 2 politically active young men inevitably appeared to many observers as more than an isolated act of violence. The coincidence in timing encouraged speculation almost immediately. Some wondered whether the murders formed part of the same broader political conflict. Others questioned whether the victims had become targets because of information they possessed or activities in which they had participated. Investigators examined these possibilities carefully. Yet after years of inquiry, no reliable evidence established a direct connection between the murders and the kidnapping of Aldo Moro. The timing remained extraordinary, but extraordinary timing alone could never substitute for proof. The investigation, therefore, continued searching elsewhere for answers. As the inquiry developed, political motivation emerged as the leading explanation. The appearance of leaflets claiming responsibility in the name of far-right extremist organizations, including NAR, Brigada Combatant Franco Anselmi, directed considerable attention toward extremist networks operating during the years of Lead. Investigators examined these claims seriously while recognizing their limitations. A claim of responsibility, particularly during an era when competing extremist organizations often sought publicity, could not by itself identify the actual perpetrators. Detectives therefore attempted to connect the documents with individuals who might have participated in the attack. Their investigation eventually focused significant attention on Massimo Carminati, Mario Corsi, and Claudio Bracci because of their alleged links to far-right extremist circles. Authorities repeatedly stated that there were significant investigative indications concerning these individuals. Yet the distinction between investigative suspicion and judicial proof remained decisive throughout the case. No evidence capable of satisfying the legal standards required for prosecution or conviction ever emerged. Consequently, despite decades of discussion, no court has established that these individuals committed the murders. Another theory suggested that Fausto and Iaio had been gathering information concerning heroin trafficking in Milan, documenting drug distribution points and possible connections between organized crime and extremist groups. According to some journalists and independent investigators, this activity may have exposed them to dangerous individuals with strong motives to silence them. The theory offered one possible explanation for why 2 young activists who were not members of armed organizations might nevertheless become victims of a highly organized attack. Yet here again, investigators encountered the same obstacle that repeatedly appeared throughout the case. The available evidence never established this hypothesis as fact. Without sufficient corroboration, the alleged heroin investigation remained an unproven possibility rather than a judicially established motive. Over time, these competing theories gradually came to illustrate the central difficulty of the case. Numerous explanations appeared plausible when viewed independently. Political extremism reflected the broader climate of the years of Lead. Organized crime offered another possible motive. The extraordinary timing relative to Aldo Moro's kidnapping invited additional speculation. Yet plausibility alone cannot resolve a homicide investigation. Every theory ultimately required evidence demonstrating precisely who planned the ambush, who carried it out, and why Fausto and Iaio became the intended targets. Decades of investigation never produced answers satisfying those requirements. Time itself became one of the investigation's greatest adversaries. Every year that passed reduced the likelihood that witnesses would remember small, but potentially crucial details. Investigative methods available during the late 1970s could not preserve or analyze evidence with the capabilities developed decades later. Physical evidence deteriorated or disappeared. The frequently discussed disappearance of the wool cap recovered at the crime scene became one of the clearest examples of opportunities that could never be recreated. Modern forensic science has solved numerous historical crimes by re-examining evidence preserved from earlier decades. Yet forensic technology can analyze only what still exists. Evidence that has been lost forever cannot benefit from scientific advances, no matter how sophisticated they become. This reality explains why the reopening of the investigation in 2024 and its formal authorization in May 2025 attracted renewed public attention. The decision reflected neither certainty nor optimism that the case had already been solved. Instead, it acknowledged that unresolved murders deserve continued examination whenever surviving evidence permits renewed analysis. Investigators planned to reassess the responsibility leaflets using modern forensic methods, review all remaining evidence, and once again evaluate the possible involvement of suspects connected with far-right extremist networks. Whether these efforts will ultimately produce definitive judicial conclusions remains unknown. The reopening nevertheless demonstrates an enduring commitment to pursuing truth even after decades have passed. It also reflects the persistence of the victims' families and the support of the authorities in Milan, whose continued efforts prevented the case from fading entirely into history. The legacy of Fausto and IAIO therefore extends beyond the investigation itself. Their names have become inseparable from discussions of the years of lead because they represent more than victims of a single unsolved crime. They symbolize the countless ordinary lives affected by extraordinary political violence. Neither young man held political office. Neither commanded armed organizations. Neither occupied a position of national prominence before his death. They were students, friends, and participants in the social life of their community. Yet their murders became part of one of Italy's most painful historical periods because violence, during those years, frequently reached beyond those directly engaged in armed conflict. Remembering Fausto and IAIO today, therefore, requires more than remembering how they died. It also requires remembering who they were before the investigation began. They were two 18-year-old friends whose final plans involved nothing more remarkable than walking home for dinner. That ordinary intention stands in stark contrast to the extraordinary historical significance there. Deaths would later acquire. It is easy, after decades of investigation and public discussion, to view them primarily through the lens of politics, criminal investigations, or historical controversy. Yet beneath every theory and every legal document remain two young lives interrupted before adulthood had truly begun. That perspective reminds us that the purpose of criminal justice extends beyond identifying perpetrators. It also seeks to restore, as much as possible, the dignity of those whose lives were taken. Even when complete justice proves elusive, preserving an accurate historical record remains essential. For that reason, the distinction between confirmed fact and speculation continues to matter. The investigation produced important evidence, significant suspicions, and numerous hypotheses. But it also demonstrated the necessity of restraint when certainty cannot be achieved. Responsible historical memory demands acknowledging what remains unknown rather than replacing uncertainty with assumption. In the case of Fausto and IAIO, that means recognizing both the considerable investigative work carried out over nearly half a century and the reality that no court has yet established who committed the murders. The absence of definitive answers should encourage continued inquiry rather than unsupported conclusions. Ultimately, the story of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci remains unfinished. Their murders continue to stand among the most enduring, unresolved political crimes associated with Italy's years of lead because the search for judicial truth remains ongoing. Whether future investigation will finally identify those responsible cannot yet be known. Until that day arrives, if it ever does, Via Mancinelli remains more than the location of a historical crime. It remains a place where two young friends took their final steps together, where an investigation began that has outlived generations of investigators, and where history continues to ask a question that only evidence, not speculation, can answer. That enduring search for truth is perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Fausto and Iannucci case, reminding us that while time can alter cities, governments, and societies, it does not erase the obligation to seek justice for lives taken far too soon. The deaths of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci, the story of their murder remains suspended between memory and investigation. It is a case defined by what is known and what remains unknown, by facts established on the night of the crime and questions that have survived through generations. The passage of time has changed almost everything surrounding the event. The political atmosphere of late 1970s Italy belongs to history. The violent confrontations that once dominated daily life have faded from the streets. The young activists of that era have grown older, and many of those who investigated the case in its earliest years are no longer involved. Yet the central mystery remains exactly where it began. Who ordered and carried out the ambush that killed two 18-year-old friends walking home in Milan on March 18, 1978? The importance of the Fausto and Iannucci case lies not only in the identities of those who may have been responsible, but also in what the investigation reveals about an entire period of Italian history. The years of lead were marked by fear, ideological conflict, and violence committed by groups positioned at opposite extremes of the political spectrum. During those years, acts of terrorism and political assassination created an environment where ordinary citizens could become victims of conflicts far larger than themselves. The murders of Fausto and Iannucci remain one of the clearest examples of this tragic reality. They were young men involved in the social and political life of their community, but there is no evidence that they belonged to armed organizations. Their deaths demonstrated how political violence could reach people who were not combatants, people whose lives were defined not by weapons or underground operations, but by friendship, education, and participation in their local environment. The enduring attention surrounding the case also comes from the contrast between the simplicity of the victims' lives and the complexity of the investigation that followed. Before March 18, 1978, Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci were known primarily by those around them. They were students. They spent time at Leoncavallo. They shared friendships and interests common among young people of their generation. Nothing about their daily lives suggested that they would later become central figures in one of Italy's most debated unsolved murders. Their names became nationally recognized only because of the violence that ended their lives. This transformation from ordinary young men into symbols of an unresolved historical tragedy remains one of the most painful aspects of the case. The investigation that followed their deaths reflected the complexity of the era in which the crime occurred. Authorities were forced to consider multiple possibilities because almost every aspect of the attack suggested political significance. The killers appeared organized. They acted quickly. They showed no interest in robbery or negotiation. They seemed to have selected their victims deliberately. These elements naturally directed attention toward political motives, especially given the wider context of extremist violence in Italy. The claims of responsibility attributed to far-right extremist circles strengthened this direction of inquiry, leading investigators to examine possible connections with groups such as NAR, Brigada Combatant Franco Anselmi. Yet the legal process demonstrated an important distinction that remains central throughout the entire case. A theory may appear convincing. A suspect may appear connected to a particular environment. Investigators may discover circumstances that suggest responsibility. But a criminal conviction requires evidence that can establish guilt according to legal standards. In the case of Fausto and IIO, that final step was never achieved. The investigation produced many questions, but never produced a judicial conclusion identifying the perpetrators. The same challenge appeared in the alternative theories surrounding the murders. The possibility that Fausto and IIO had gathered information about heroin trafficking in Milan created another potential explanation. It suggested that their activities may have placed them in danger beyond the political conflicts of the period. However, without evidence confirming that this activity was connected to the murders, the theory remained only one possible interpretation among several. Likewise, the timing of the murders, occurring shortly after Aldo Moro's kidnapping, created speculation about a possible connection with the Red Brigade's crisis. Yet the investigation found no reliable evidence establishing a direct relationship between the two events. The history of the case, therefore, became a history of possibilities that could not become proof. This distinction is perhaps the most important lesson of the Fausto and IIO investigation. In public discussions, unresolved cases often become surrounded by competing narratives. Over time, theories may become repeated so frequently that they begin to appear like established facts. However, the responsibility of historical examination is to preserve the difference between what has been demonstrated and what remains uncertain. The murders of Fausto and IIO contain many unresolved questions, but uncertainty itself is part of the historical truth. Acknowledging what is unknown does not weaken the search for justice. Instead, it protects the integrity of that search. The reopening of the investigation in 2025 represents the continuation of that search. It does not provide an answer that decades of investigation could not establish. It does not change the fact that no person has been convicted. Instead, it represents a renewed attempt to examine surviving evidence with modern methods and reconsider information that may not have been fully understood in the past. The renewed investigation focuses on analyzing responsibility claims, reviewing remaining evidence, and reassessing possible links involving individuals connected to far-right extremist networks. Whether these efforts will finally produce a definitive judicial outcome remains uncertain. However, the decision to continue investigating demonstrates that unresolved crimes do not necessarily disappear simply because time has passed. For the families of Fausto and IIO, the reopening carries a significance that extends beyond legal procedures. It represents recognition that their loss remains meaningful and that the search for answers continues. The passage of decades may change the circumstances surrounding a case, but it does not reduce the importance of understanding what happened. Every unanswered question represents not only an investigative challenge, but also a reminder of two lives interrupted. The names Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci continue to be remembered because their story reflects a larger human reality. Behind every historical event are individuals whose personal experiences are often overshadowed by political and social consequences. It is easy to discuss the case through the language of terrorism, extremist groups, investigations, and legal procedures. Yet at its center are two young men who never had the opportunity to experience adulthood beyond 18 years old. Remembering them means looking beyond the mystery and recognizing the people they were before, becoming symbols. The continuing discussion of the case also reflects Italy's broader effort to understand the legacy of years of lead. That period left behind many unresolved questions and painful memories. Some cases reached judicial conclusions. Others remained uncertain. The murder of Fausto and Io belongs among those unresolved events that continue to challenge historians, investigators, and society itself. It represents the difficulty of confronting a past shaped by political violence while maintaining commitment to evidence and truth. The future of the investigation remains unknown. New analysis may reveal information that was unavailable in 1978. Existing evidence may provide new perspectives, or the case may continue to resist definitive resolution. Whatever happens, the fundamental responsibility remains the same: to remember the victims accurately and to avoid replacing unanswered questions with unsupported certainty. The story of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci is ultimately a story about the search for truth across time. It is about two young men whose lives ended in a moment of violence, about families who continued demanding answers, about investigators who followed difficult paths through incomplete evidence, and about a society that refuses to forget. Nearly half a century later, the question remains open. The investigation continues because the need for truth continues, until the day evidence provides a definitive answer. The names Fausto and Io will remain connected to one of Italy's most enduring mysteries, not only as victims of an unsolved crime, but as reminders that behind every case file, every theory, and every historical debate are human lives that deserve to be remembered. The story of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo Iannucci does not end with a verdict, a confession, or a courtroom declaration of responsibility. Instead, it remains one of those rare criminal cases in which the absence of a final answer has become part of its identity. Nearly 50 years after the events of March 18, 1978, the murders continue to represent both a personal tragedy for two families and a historical wound connected to one of the most turbulent periods in modern Italian history. The passage of time has not erased the significance of what happened on Via Mancinelli. If anything, the decades that followed have made the unresolved nature of the case even more powerful, because each passing year raises the same fundamental question that investigators faced from the beginning. Why were two 18-year-old friends deliberately targeted and killed? From the beginning, the evidence suggested that the attack was not random. The circumstances surrounding the murders created a clear impression of planning and preparation. Fausto and Io were not victims of a robbery. They were not involved in a reported confrontation immediately before the shooting. They were not given a warning or an opportunity to understand why they had become targets. Instead, they were confronted by three unknown men who appeared to have been waiting for them. The attack lasted less than a minute. Approximately 8 rounds were fired from a .32 caliber firearm. The attackers escaped quickly on motorcycles. Every element of the crime scene suggested a deliberate act carried out with a specific objective. Yet identifying that objective and proving who carried it out became the central challenge that defined the investigation for decades. The tragedy of the case is not that investigators ignored the murders or failed to pursue possible explanations. On the contrary, the inquiry examined numerous possibilities. Authorities investigated personal conflicts, criminal motives, political connections, and extremist organizations. They followed leads involving claims of responsibility, examined possible links with far-right networks, and considered whether the victims' activities might have placed them in danger. The investigation was extensive because the circumstances demanded that every possibility be considered. But extensive investigation does not always guarantee a definitive result. In the case of Fausto and Io, the available evidence repeatedly stopped short of the level required for a criminal conviction. The most discussed investigative direction involved far-right extremism. The appearance of responsibility claims connected to NAR Brigada Combatant Franco Anselmi-led investigators toward networks associated with political violence during the years of lead. Individuals including Massimo Carminati, Mario Corsi, and Claudio Bracci became associated with the investigation because of their connections to extremist circles at the time. However, the legal process required more than association or suspicion. No evidence emerged that was sufficient to prove in court that any of these individuals committed the murders. This distinction remains essential when looking back at the case today. A person may appear within an investigation because authorities believe that person deserves examination. That does not mean guilt has been established. The difference between being investigated and being convicted is one of the foundations of justice. The Fausto and I. Joe case demonstrates how difficult it can be to maintain that distinction when public emotions are strong and the desire for answers is overwhelming. Another significant aspect of the case is the number of possible explanations that emerged without reaching certainty. The hypothesis involving heroin trafficking in Milan suggested that Fausto and Io may have been collecting information about drug distribution networks and possible connections between criminal organizations and extremist groups. The theory attracted attention because it offered a possible explanation for why two young activists could become victims of a highly organized assassination. Yet without sufficient evidence connecting this alleged activity to the murders, it remained only a theory. Similarly, the possibility of a connection to the kidnapping of Aldo Moro captured public attention because of the timing. The murders occurred only 2 days after the Red Brigades abducted the former prime minister, placing Italy in an atmosphere of national crisis. However, despite speculation and investigation, no reliable evidence established a direct connection between the two events. These unresolved theories reveal something important about the nature of historical investigations. The existence of multiple possibilities does not mean that all possibilities are equally true. It means that investigators faced a complex situation in which several explanations appeared possible, but none could be proven conclusively. The responsibility of the justice system is not merely to identify what seems likely. It is to establish what can be demonstrated through evidence. In this case, that final demonstration never occurred. One of the most painful aspects of the investigation is the role played by time. When a crime remains unresolved for decades, the passage of time becomes another barrier between the victims and the truth. Witnesses may forget details. Physical evidence may be damaged, lost, or become impossible to analyze. Investigative methods that were unavailable at the time of the crime may arrive too late. The disappearance of the wool cap recovered at the crime scene became a symbol of these lost opportunities. Modern forensic science has transformed the investigation of many historical crimes. But technology cannot examine evidence that no longer exists. The case, therefore, carries not only the question of who committed the murders, but also the question of what answers may have been possible if different investigative tools and procedures had existed in 1978. The reopening of the investigation in 2024 and its formal authorization in May 2025 brought renewed attention to the case because they represented a willingness to reconsider what remained unresolved. The purpose of reopening the inquiry was not to confirm existing theories, but to examine surviving evidence again. Modern forensic techniques offered the possibility of discovering information that earlier investigators could not access. The renewed investigation also demonstrated the importance of persistence from those who continued seeking answers, including the victims' families and supporters who refused to allow the case to disappear into history. Yet, even with renewed attention, the legal reality remains unchanged. No person has been convicted. No court has established the identity of the perpetrators. The murders remain officially unsolved. This reality should not be interpreted as a failure to recognize the importance of the victims. Instead, it reflects the difficult balance between the emotional need for answers and the legal requirement for proof. Justice cannot be built upon assumptions, even when those assumptions appear convincing. It must be built upon evidence capable of establishing the truth in a manner that can withstand examination. The memory of Fausto and IIO, therefore, depends not only on the search for those responsible, but also on preserving the accuracy of what is known. They should not be remembered only through theories surrounding their deaths. They should be remembered as two young people whose lives existed before the tragedy. Fausto Tonelli was born on November 25, 1959. He was a high school student from a working-class family who participated in activities at the Leoncavallo Social Center. Lorenzo IIO Iannucci was born on September 29, 1959. He was Fausto's close friend and, like him, part of the active left-wing youth movement in Milan during the late 1970s. Their identities were not defined by the violence that took their lives. The violence came afterward, transforming their names into symbols of a national tragedy. Remembering them requires looking beyond the investigation and recognizing the human reality at the center of the case. They were young men with friendships, routines, and plans for the future. Their final evening was not supposed to become a historical event. It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday. The tragedy lies precisely in that contrast. Two normal lives interrupted by an extraordinary act of violence. The continuing attention surrounding the case also reflects Italy's broader relationship with the legacy of the years of Lead. That period left behind unresolved questions about political violence, responsibility, and accountability. Some events from that era reached judicial conclusions. Others remained surrounded by uncertainty. The murders of Fausto and IIO belong to the second category, but their significance has not diminished because of that uncertainty. Instead, their case continues to represent the importance of confronting difficult chapters of history honestly and carefully. Nearly 50 years later, the investigation continues to exist between past and present. It carries the weight of the original tragedy while also representing the possibility that new methods may still reveal new information. Whether the renewed inquiry will finally provide the answers sought since 1978 remains unknown. What matters is that the search continues according to the principles that should guide every investigation: respect for evidence, respect for victims, and commitment to truth. The story of Fausto Tonelli and Lorenzo IIO Iannucci remains unfinished because justice has not yet reached its final chapter. But unfinished does not mean forgotten. Their names continue to be remembered because their lives mattered and because the questions surrounding their deaths still demand serious attention. The streets of Milan have changed since that evening in March 1978. The political climate of Italy has changed. The generation that lived through the years of Lead has grown older. Yet the memory of two 18-year-old friends remains. Their story endures as a reminder that behind every investigation file, every political theory, and every historical debate are human beings whose futures were taken away, until the truth is established through evidence and law. The case of Fausto and IIO will remain one of Italy's most haunting unresolved mysteries, a reminder that the passage of time may make answers harder to find, but it does not remove the responsibility to continue searching for them.